Today, fast white steamships travel across the Caribbean with cargoes more valuable than pirates' gold. And officers in trim white uniforms pick up their golden cargoes from a place we call Banana Land.
Banana Land, otherwise known as the country of Guatemala, was not actually the happy, tropical paradise American companies of the 1950s advertised it as. In reality, U.S. imperialists exerted undue control over the economy and peasantry through corporations like the United Fruit Company, which owned 40% of Guatemala's arable land alongside its railroads, ports, and telecommunications system. The bananas American families ate and the profits the UFC earned came at a high price. While U.S. involvement in Guatemala may have started out as a purely economic pursuit, their efforts to protect the financial interests of a powerful corporation eventually led them down a dark path of human rights violations. American support for the United Fruit Company and fear of communism spread in Central America incited, encouraged, and actively assisted in the violence that erupted in the long and tragic Guatemalan Civil War. Over 36 years, 200,000 Guatemalan people would lose their lives, marking a massive genocide of indigenous Maya with lasting impacts.
In 1954, the U.S. orchestrated coup, known as Project PB Success, would become the match that lit the fire of the Guatemalan Civil War. Amid rising Cold War tensions, the U.S. had its eye trained on Guatemala's president, Jacobo Arbenz. In 1952, President Arbenz had issued Decree 900, an agrarian reform law that mandated the redistribution of idle land holdings greater than 223 acres to landless peasants, a move many Americans labeled as communist. Although Arbenz offered to pay for the land at its tax value, the United Fruit Company would not risk this challenge to their power and called upon the United States government for assistance. In 1953, the CIA quietly put its plan for takeover into motion. Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas received cash, weapons, and pilots from the U.S. to supply the mission. Training camps in Nicaragua prepared mercenaries under American supervision, and a radio station urged Guatemalans to support the liberation. By May of 1954, PB Success was ready. Propaganda, sabotage, and diplomatic isolation had cornered President Arbenz, who unsuccessfully sought a meeting with President Eisenhower. On June 17th, 300 CIA-backed fighters invaded. 10 days later, Arbenz resigned, and by July 2nd, Armas had taken control. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the U.S. gave millions of dollars to the Guatemalan military and lent their military expertise to help form death squads and train soldiers in the use of weapons like napalm. However, this aid came to a grinding halt in 1977 when civil rights organizations presented evidence of concerning violence in Guatemala to President Carter and the U.S. Congress. While aid was officially cut off from 1977 to 1982, some U.S. personnel exploited a loophole to continue instructing members of the Guatemalan military.
But no Guatemalan leader had a closer public relationship with the U.S. military than General Rios Montt, the de facto president of Guatemala who won his position in a 1982 coup. General Rios Montt's hard line on communism in his country caught the attention of another staunch anti-communist, U.S. President Ronald Reagan. Reagan believed that reinstating American military support to Guatemala could allow Rios Montt to regain control over the guerrilla groups and end the violence that had concerned his predecessor. Research by members of the U.S. State Department and a report published by the human rights organization Amnesty International proved Reagan's theory wrong. The majority of the 2,600 deaths that had occurred during Rios Montt's 9 months in office had been perpetrated by the military. Rios Montt seemed unwilling or unable to control this indiscriminate killing of civilians. In full knowledge of the military's actions against its own people, the Reagan administration officially restored military aid to Guatemala at the end of 1982. On December 5th, Reagan and General Rios Montt celebrated the renewed diplomatic relationship of their countries at a meeting in Honduras, where Reagan commended Rios Montt as
a man of great personal integrity and commitment,
and publicly expressed his confidence in Rios Montt's ability to end the violence. But an end to the violence was the last idea General Rios Montt had in mind. Hours after President Reagan and General Rios Montt's friendly meeting, special forces of the Guatemalan military left for the village of Dos Aires, preparing to commit one of the deadliest atrocities of the Civil War.
4 years prior, in 1978, Federico Aquino Ruano and Marco Reyes founded the northern Guatemalan village of Dos Eres. The original settlers built a school, 2 churches, and dug a well, intending for these facilities to be places of community gathering. Mostly small-scale farmers, the villagers cultivated bananas, pineapples, and chilies. The 60 families who lived in town were primarily Latino, being of both Spanish and indigenous descent. The villagers lived in peace until September 1982, when the local military commissioner tried to recruit them for the Civil Defense Patrol in a neighboring town. Their hesitation to join led the Guatemalan military to label them as guerrilla sympathizers. 1 month later, the army would come face to face with the legitimate guerrillas when a convoy near Dos Eres was ambushed, killing 21 soldiers and taking 19 rifles. Although the ambush had no connection to the villagers, the army quickly fabricated evidence to blame Dos Eres and began their devastating retaliation. An elite special operations force of the Guatemalan military called the Caibiles were given the Dos Eres assignment. Created as a counterinsurgency force against guerrillas, the Caibiles received the intense physical and psychological training to be laser-focused instruments of destruction.
At dawn on December 7, 1982, 58 Caibiles entered Dos Eres. Dressed as guerrillas, they intended to pin their actions on leftist groups as they surrounded the town and gathered the villagers. Men were herded into the school while women and children were brought into one of the town's churches. With homes evacuated, the Caibiles searched for communist propaganda or any evidence of guerrilla sympathy, which they found none of. Around midday, the Caibiles forced some of the women to cook them food. After the Caibiles ate, they began to bring people to the town center near a dry well. Vaccinations, the soldiers insisted, would be administered here. Civilians were assured that they would be safe. Instead, the first blood in what would become a massacre was drawn as a Caibile hurled a 3-month infant down the dry well. Adults were made to kneel next to the well, blindfolded, and were interrogated about the rifles stolen in October, as well as their knowledge of guerrilla leaders. When the inhabitants pleaded their innocence, they were struck in the head with sledgehammers and thrown into the dry well, where the bodies began to pile up. The attack lasted 3 days. The villagers witnessed and experienced unimaginable atrocities. The death count amounted to over 250 men, women, and children combined, nearly the entire population of Dos Eres. In the end, only 2 boys of 3 and 5 years old lived to tell the story of the victims. Burned houses, abandoned fields. From a helicopter, officials from the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala saw for themselves what was left of Dos Eres after hearing rumors of so-called rebels slaughtering more than 200 people. In late December 1982, a cable was sent to Washington, D.C. from the embassy, concluding that, quote, the party most likely responsible for this incident is the Guatemalan army. The U.S. chose to take no action on this information. Years later, declassified U.S. records and the work of local forensic agencies would begin to uncover the true events of the Dos Eres tragedy.
One-sidedness of the conflict.
Dos Eres may be the most prominent massacre of the Guatemalan Civil War, but it is far from the only example. The Guatemalan government used their scorched earth philosophy to justify razing entire towns, with innocent civilians suffering the most. During Efrain Rios Mont's 17-month rule alone, 15,000 to 16,000 people were executed. Over 1,000 disappeared, and 170 villages, just like Dos Eres, were leveled. Following the 1994 investigation into the Dos Eres massacre, 4 former soldiers were tried and convicted for their violent roles in the tragic event. In August 2011, they received their symbolic sentences of 30 years for each murder and 30 years for crimes against humanity, totaling 6,060 years each. The trial was the beginning of a long-awaited justice for the destroyed village of Dos Eres and the thousands of Guatemalans who lived similar stories during the Civil War. While research and dedication over many decades made justice on a small scale possible, it is unlikely that the institutions of power which ordered and enabled such destruction will ever be held fully accountable. The U.S. government has yet to acknowledge its significant role in knowingly aiding the Guatemalan genocide.